Hey all, it occurred to me recently that on many of my videos, I assume you use Tailwind CSS, and that is pre-configured on my template that I tend to use as well for Ruby on Rails. So when I create a new Rails app, I'll tend to preface that app with a template I've already kind of done some groundwork on that installs a few gems, sets up the app, and just gets it going so it's quick and easy to get an app up and running for me, just for tutorial reasons. But it occurs to me I don't actually have a tutorial on how to add Tailwind CSS to Rails specifically. So I wanted to do a video of that, just walking through the manual way of adding that to the app. I think it's a really great framework that I pretty much leverage daily now, that isn't so opinionated. If you're new to Tailwind CSS, it's a whole new approach. Not whole new, but it is a newer approach to writing CSS, and the fact that you don't author CSS, you essentially add classes to your markup that already have a set of boundaries installed on that class. So it's something like padding or margin, whatever. There's just a lot of utility classes you can use, and in combination, they make the app or whatever you're designing, your own brand. So it feels the way you want it to. So let's first create a vanilla Rails app. This will have nothing. It'll be the base 6.02 Rails app at this time of recording. So I'm just going to create a new app real quick. So Rails new, I'll just say Tailwind demo. And we'll create the app. It won't reference any of my templates or anything like that. So you can follow along without needing any of that stuff, which is great. Under the hood, it's going to install the necessary gems we need. We'll need to add some node-based stuff. That's all going to be brought possible thanks to the Webpacker gem that gets installed by default now in Rails 6. If you're on an older version of Rails, maybe Rails 5.2 or 4 or something, before the time of 6, Webpacker isn't a default by when you first run a new app. So you'll need to either install that gem and configure it, or just go ahead and update to Rails 6 and use it. So when this is finished, we'll continue on. Okay, so our app's installed. My MacBook's fans are kicking in. Yours might do the same if you're on a laptop. So it installed the entirety of Rails. It installed the entirety of Webpack and Node and all the dependencies we need to kind of do some awesome JavaScript under the hood. So let's go into that demo app. There we go. And right now, I'm not running 2.7 on Ruby, but I do have 2.6, which I think is the latest stable version. Or 2.7 is stable, but there's a bunch of error logging that happens that's annoying with Rails, so I've kind of downgraded for a bit. But that's nothing you need to concern yourself with right now. But what we want to do is install Tailwind. So if you reference the Tailwind docs, the quick and easiest way is to use a node package manager. And that's typically for me Yarn. So I'll go to Tailwind CSS quick. We can go just to get started, installation, and you'll just see npm or Yarn. You can use either. I just tend to gravitate towards Yarn. So let's run that. Inside our app repo, it's going to go ahead and grab Tailwind CSS and its dependencies. This is a PostCSS based library, so it's a little bit different than Sass or typical CSS. So we'll have to configure a few things. So what we need to do initially is create a configuration file as well as PostCSS within Rails to the configuration file. The step here in Tailwind is to go ahead and add your style sheet already. We'll get to that point, but we'll have to kind of do a little bit backwards in terms of setting up our app. So I'm going to do this command here next. It's npx tailwindcss.init. This is going to create a new file, and it's going to just create it at the root of your app. We'll need to actually move it. So let's go and open this up. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code and put it in a new desktop just so it's easier to see. So we've got our app here. If we go to the root of the app, you'll see the Tailwind config right here. The way I like to structure the app, and you can change this if you want to, is within the JavaScript folder is where the stuff's going to live that we need. Since this is rendered via JavaScript, we'll have to kind of create a new directory in here that I typically call style sheets. which is already in the asset pipeline version. So if you're on a traditional Rails app, the concept of the asset pipeline was kind of coined in Rails, and it's kind of been the inspiration of a lot of this node style of stuff. But the essential idea is everything in this assets directory can get compiled and referenced within Rails a specific way. And everything's kind of just automatic when you add files. You don't need to like do any crazy configuration, which is great. But when you need something like Tailwind, it's a little more advanced in terms of PostCSS. So we'll need to kind of go about and bypass that asset pipeline. So what I'll do first is create a directory here called style sheets, just to mimic what is already happening in our asset pipeline, just to kind of establish that same convention. You can change that to pretty much anything you want to do there. But the core thing that I want to add this folder for is so we can move this file into it. So in my code editor, I can drag and drop. You might need to do this manually, but we'll add that there just so we can point to it and have a home for it. So everything Tailwind will live in this directory. I'll also go ahead and create an application.scss file. You can call this whatever you want to. I'm calling my global CSS file that will get imported into the actual view. So in here, we'll actually kind of import the styles in the end. So if we go back to the actual, we can actually leverage this @import statement. I think if you use Rails specifically, Webpacker kind of does things backwards. I've found that either of these work for me, but it says to use these instead. You just import them almost like you would Sass code. So we'd have those in store there. And one thing before I actually generated that config, you notice it's empty, and that's great, but I want to actually have the default stuff that comes with Tailwind just baked in at first. We can always subtract it from there. So I'm going to redo what I did before, delete that, and then go back to the command line and run this again. And I think if you just do full, it'll give the new Tailwind config file the full default theme. So if you pass -- full, you'll get that awesome code. That's basically just a file that's already on the GitHub repo of Tailwind that Adam Lathan authored and already has in store. You can just go ahead and create it, and it's ready to go. So we'll actually just move that again to the style sheets folder and be pretty close to ready there. So we've got our import statements here. Nothing's going to work yet because we haven't actually told our PostCSS configuration what to do. Notice the file in your root of your app. It's called postcss.config.js. We'll need to reference Tailwind in this area. And this is where you initially say, hey, I want to use Tailwind to create some actual CSS on the front end. And you need to require it since it's a node module. So the way that works, and this is the way I've seen it authored and we just create an environment variable and create an object within it. We're going to end up exporting this object instead of just doing this default module exports. So we can essentially get rid of this bit real quick. And inside the environment variable, we'll say plugins. And well, I'll just copy this. Good to go. Okay, and then you may notice there's no reference to Tailwind here, so we need to actually do that to get it to work. So we'll say require Tailwind CSS. And then what I do is just open up another curly braces there and our parentheses, or what curly, I don't know what, I can't remember what they're called. And then we need to pass like the relative direct path to that Tailwind config. And notice it's in our app directory, our JavaScript directory, then in style sheets, and then it's right there. So if we do the same, we should be set. So JavaScript style sheets, and then tailwind.config.js with a comma. Make sure you have a comma there. And the rest can essentially stay the same. That comes with default. Those other ones come as you install Rails. And we'll just close that with a semicolon. And one thing I like to do in a production environment is add Purge CSS. So I'll just give give you insight of what that is. But first, let's go and export this. Good to go. Okay, so this by design should work just fine. If I spelled environment right, there we go. So right now you could use this, and Tailwind should be set up as you run Webpack in your Rails server once you boot up your server, because we have that import statement, but we still need to kind of tell our app where those things are at. So the way that works is within our view, we'll need to reference those just pretty much like they already are here. So there's already, if you're running a pretty new Rails app, you'll have this style JavaScript pack tag already. But since we're using the style sheets, we'll need to actually add a style sheet pack tag. And I've found better success if that it's before the JavaScript pack tag, just the FYI there. So this renders any PostCSS or SCSS that gets output from JavaScript into your view, as well as the JavaScript that you use. Notice they're named application. That's on purpose. So in our actual JavaScript packs file, this is what that one's referring to. And then in our style sheets, this is what that one's called too. So application. So you need to make sure those names are the same if you decide to update them. So one catch here is we still need to import our actual CSS into our JavaScript. So there's no reference to our CSS yet in our application JavaScript. So what I tend to do is just say import style sheets application, and that's all good and grand. So this is basically Tailwind CSS. Now you might want to add more to the mix, like components or whatever else. You can add it just like you would Sass or CSS on the front end normally. So let's verify this works. Let's boot up the server. Let's see what happens. I'll just go to localhost 3000. So it's going to just show us the welcome screen. You see I'm on 2.6.6 of Ruby and 6.02 of Rails. Let's create just a generic one-off controller. I'll just create a basic one. So new tab, Rails, generate controller. I'll just call it static index. Okay. So we have a static. This is just essentially just going to be static stuff, obviously by the name. But we need to change our routes to route to that. So we'll just say route to static index. So it's going to just say go to the controller static and use the index action as our route path. So let's reboot the server once. If we refresh, it should just change to a static page that just has, I think, index action. Yeah, but you notice it's reset, which is a good sign. Normally there'd be kind of a serif font there that this is using sans serif, which is all brought to you by Tailwind. So notice the font families, the system fonts, which is all configured in your Tailwind config. So if you look deep, you can find the font family. That's the basic one, is the system font, which is what we see. But to really verify this, we can go back into our application, go into the body, just say, I don't know, anti-alias, if I can spell that, font base text gray 100 BG black. We should just see some updates to this. There we go. So Tailwind is at full force right now. If you're new to Tailwind, those classes, you'll get used to them if you use it a lot, like I do. It just becomes like writing CSS in the end, which is great. I'll just give it some padding to start with. So maybe P10. There we go. So pretty cool. That's essentially the installation configuration step. At this point, you kind of are set to go. One additional step I like to do, which I mentioned earlier, is add Purge CSS. So that all happens in your PostCSS configuration file. So down below here is where I add that. And that's an actual node module, so we'll need to actually add that to our app. You can get it by running yarn add. It's called full human PostCSS Purge CSS. There's several types of Purge CSS you can install. So this is the one we'll actually harness. And you might think you need to save this as a dev dependency, so it wouldn't be actually something you'd use in production, but it actually is something you need in production. I made that mistake before, so make sure you don't just save dev on that if you're used to installing node modules. So what I do here is to check by default, since we've had Webpacker and Node installed, we have this process.env by default, which is great. So if we say if process.env.rails env, so just checking what our Rails environment's variable is set up as. If we say production, we can do these things. So it's just a conditional. So this is all piped through to our actual environment variables. So you'll need to actually, if you boot up a new app in Rails, either Heroku probably does this automatically, or if you use Hatchbox or something, they use this environment variable. You need to set to production when it's shipped live, so all those things toggle instead of like a development environment or test environment. So what I tend to do here is just use that environment variable, and you can push plugins to it. So we'll pass in the required app full human, and then PostCSS Purge CSS. And then within that, we can open up another bracket, curly braces, whatever I can't remember the name of, and pass in the content. And this is going to be basically what Purge CSS is going to look for to, find the classes that it needs to either get rid of or extra CSS we don't need. By the way, that's what this library does. It gets rid of CSS you aren't using or can't find within a given view. So I'll actually pass the reference of views and files in. So we'll just have what our views are going to be. So typically that's ERB in a Rails app. You might also have helpers that are Ruby. So we'll just give this .rb, and then in your app helpers folder, sometimes you render HTML out with Tailwind classes on it. And then also if you use JavaScript, we'll do the same there. And then say you're a React guy or a Vue guy, maybe the same there. So we could just say, no, not Vue. React doesn't have its own. Maybe JSX though. .jsx. Something like that. Okay. Now we need to provide more or less a regex pattern to go ahead and signify what should match. So this is part of that library. I would read the documentation to get a full grasp. But we go like so, and we'll pass in the content, which is our templates here we defined. And then loop through, do a match. And I'll try to get this right so I don't screw it up. So A through capital Z, A through lowercase z, 0 through 9, dash, underscore, colon, // plus / G. And then you could just say or an empty array. It's kind of just as a catch-all there. And that's essentially it. So this just happens in production. You won't see this happen locally unless you go ahead and uncomment that. But the idea is when you ship it or deploy it and it goes into its production node environment, this setting will change to production, and this will run, and it will purge CSS. So it'll essentially remove CSS you don't already use. And one gotcha I've had is I had a point where CSS was getting removed. So oftentimes I'll create components for my styles and I'll import them. I think they typically go like right in within this section here. A cool thing you can do with Purge CSS is basically tell it to skip stuff. And this is how I do it. So you need the bang here, the exclamation point, to make sure this comment doesn't get removed in the compilation of the code. And then you can write Purge CSS, start, ignore. And then we'll do the same of end ignore. My dog is snoring. Awesome. And then like here you can add your at import components button. So oftentimes I'll create components for buttons because they're reusable. You just create like a button class in another folder. So components and button. Maybe you'd have a btn class, and then within Tailwind you'd need the apply statement because it's a PostCSS thing. So you can actually apply your own classes or just write traditional CSS here. I tend to just use the add apply statement, so I make everything consistent. So then I'll have padding of like px3, py2, text base, so on and so forth. So text color, I don't know, text gray, 800, bg white, border, rounded, etc. So there's your default button or something, and then you can just create variants. Import that here on production environment. Once you deploy, this will go ahead and skip this file altogether because you don't want to lose some of that stuff if it's not actually in use. And maybe you haven't used a button class, but you want it in your arsenal so it doesn't get passed up in the end. So with this in place, we can go ahead and probably reboot the server again and boot up our template. It should just basically be the same. Now it looks like we have an issue. Import components button. I think I called it buttons. Yeah, so that's one perk that Rails just kind of automatically compiles Tailwind when you're running the server. It doesn't do live reloading, but I can show you how that works. So we'll refresh. It's compiling now, I'm assuming. Yep, there we go. And there we go. So the same look and feel. If you don't want to just refresh with your key commands every time, this is typically a call for Webpack dev server. And to run that, you would need to just do, I think in the wrong app, there we go. You need to run bin /Webpack dev server. And this can boot up in a new terminal instance next to your actual Rails server, which I have running here. And this will go ahead and compile Webpack in real time. So anytime you make changes to your JavaScript or CSS in this case, it will go ahead and update. So if we pass that in, we'll be good to go. I'll go ahead and remove this stuff for now just to show you by example. We can just go into like application for now and just say body at apply bg black or blue. Let's do something different. Text white. And then if I just save that down, this should go ahead and refresh without me doing anything. And it did. So that's essentially it. I know I moved kind of quickly there, but getting Tailwind installed, it's a little trickier than just following the docs here. But at the same time with Rails, there's a few gotchas in terms of where things should go. So I tend to just go and add a new style sheets directory in the JavaScript folder, reference our import of that file in our main application.js that gets added to your application layout right here. And then do the same with the style sheet pack tag that you generate here. So when that JavaScript gets rendered, the styles get extracted with Webpack and everything's just fine and dandy. Getting Tailwind, of course, installed, you need to run the yarn package install or node package, import the base styles that it needs in utilities, and then to set your configuration right here. Like I said, I used this default and then just subtract colors and stuff I don't need along the way to save space. But ultimately, if you just use the default here and rely on your post CSS config using this Purge CSS utility, you can kind of save a step. It kind of gives you that benefit of the doubt. And then from there, of course, pass your config to Tailwind itself. So I hope that made sense. This is something I pretty much implore on most of my Rails apps these days. I know Tailwind isn't for everyone, but it is a library I find myself highly productive in. And it's just quick and easy to get like a prototype or an app out the door that you're maybe brainstorming about or just want to get an MVP launched. And I find it's a great use case for that, rather than having to figure out what to name a CSS class or an ID, etc. when you go ahead and launch something. So hope that was useful. I'll go ahead and share this code in the description and or blog posts that you'll maybe find this on. So if you guys want to check out this code and reuse it, feel free. And until then, I will see you in the next video. All right, peace. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.